What happened to the Vance family remains a chilling mystery. Dr. Daniel Vance, a brilliant but paranoid scientist, predicted the apocalypse and vanished with his wife and 5 children into the woods. But when I stumbled upon their eerie, high-tech bunker, abandoned for 3 years, what I found was more unsettling than I could have imagined. What dark secrets were they hiding? What went wrong? Hit like, subscribe, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. This is a story you don't want to miss. I found the bunker of a prepper family who went missing 3 years ago. Dr. Daniel Vance was a smart man. Too smart for his own good, maybe. 40 years old, a lecturer in fluid dynamics with a mind made of shapes and numbers. No one knows why, but one day, on a whim, he crunched the numbers on the apocalypse and came to a troubling conclusion. He didn't share exactly what it was he'd deduced, but given that he immediately quit his job and liquidated his many assets, it's fair to say it wasn't positive. Swept up in the wake of this tremendous upheaval was his wife, a 24-year-old PhD student who had grown infatuated with Daniel some time before. She loved the strange bear of a man who could just as easily build a log cabin as he could explain the idiosyncrasies of an asteroid's orbit. Speaking to Daniel always left you with the profound impression he was right, so when he told her what he wanted to do, she agreed. 15 years and 5 children later, the Vances were living in the distant woods just beyond my hometown. They were enigmatic, richer than the Pope, and extremely serious about their prepper lifestyle. But they were also funny, easygoing, and incredibly compelling to speak to. Larger-than-life survivalists who swept into town with bizarre requests that thrilled local businesses. Vast quantities of cement, iron, lead, and steel were all shipped through the remote mountains so that the Vances could build their shelter. The advanced methods they used to keep it secret were legendary. Daniel had once spent 6 months earning the license necessary to drive HGVs up to his compound so that no one else would lay eyes on it. And on one occasion, when a company had refused his request for GPS tracker-free vehicles, he bought them out wholesale so that they had no choice. So when they stopped appearing in town during the pandemic, when requests for food and goods stopped and all contact was dropped, most attributed it to lockdown. They had a bunker and had spent their entire lives training to be self-sufficient in the face of civilization's collapse. Even Alexander, the youngest at just 3, was already collecting firewood as a chore and learning what local plants were edible. Most of us just assumed that if anyone could ride out COVID without breaking a sweat, it would be the Vances. The reality turned out to be something else. When the worst came to light, we discovered that Daniel had used the pandemic as an excuse for a dry run. The family intended to spend 6 months in lockdown and essentially beta test their fallout bunker. 3 months in, and the sheriff received a distress call on the radio. Coordinates were provided by the hushed voice of a sobbing child that most assume was Alexander, even though that's never been proven. The police arrived and found the bunker still sealed. It took hours for emergency responders to cut into the door. All the while, efforts were made to contact the family within, but to no avail. Once inside, police were left dumbfounded. There was no one to be rescued, no bodies, no survivors. There was evidence the door's locking mechanism had failed and trapped the Vances inside with no way out. But if so, where had they gone? Beds and cots lay everywhere with moldering yellow sheets, buckets close to hand with stains all around them. Some doors were barred, others smashed to pieces. There was even evidence of makeshift quarantines and, in places, what looked like violence. The police, usually a fantastic source of gossip, were not forthcoming until the town demanded answers, and the sheriff was forced to offer only the barest of outlines. An outbreak of a waterborne illness had struck the Vances down not long after they were locked inside and unable to seek help. Rumors of contagion were overstated, fueled by the unrelated rise of COVID. Whatever contaminant had killed the Vances, it was non-organic in nature. No need to panic. The Vances' loved ones had been notified. The bunker was going to be demolished, and we could all put this terrible tragedy behind us. Of course, we still had questions. 1,000 of them. Why hadn't the family called for help? They had radios, computers, smartphones too. They were survivalists, not Amish. And where were they? What had happened to their bodies? Why hadn't they simply left? We shouted these and more at the town meeting, but the police simply refused to comment. For most of us, the excitement lasted another week or two until we realized we weren't getting answers anytime soon. Besides, the pandemic was in full swing and most of us had other things to worry about. The tragic story eventually faded until it was just one of those awful things in the town's history that we didn't talk about. I was as guilty as anyone else of just forgetting about it. I certainly never expected to find the bunker out there in the woods, faded police tape still on the open door that hung wide open with scorch marks around the lock. It stood out in the woods like someone had cut a hole right in the fabric of reality, the darkness so deep and black it almost ached to look at. The sight of it made my heart drop into my stomach. It radiated pain. Does that make sense? I think some part of my lizard brain picked out details that wouldn't become apparent to me until I got closer, like the bloody finger streaks that stained the handle from where someone had scrabbled furiously at the lock without success. And the tiny viewing window had been smashed with a hammer that still lay nearby. I needed only to glimpse it to imagine the family taking turns to stand there and scream into the woods desperate for rescue. Under any other circumstances, I would have run. But I'd gone there looking for my dog, and my light revealed a few wet paw prints making their way down the dusty concrete tunnel. Half Bernese and half collie, Ripley is the sort of dog who trembles in my arms when a storm buffets the windows and needs his paws held when we brush him. I love him. I do not have much of a family or a wife or even many friends, but I have Ripley, and I could no more have turned around and gone home to an empty apartment where I would have to sob my grief away than I could flap my arms and fly. He was my dog, and I'd raised him since he was a puppy, and I wasn't going to leave him out in those woods. I went in after him. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew it wouldn't be good. Whatever the police had found, they'd not only kept most of the morbid details to themselves, they had also lied. The bunker was not demolished, or even sealed off. In fact, looking at the occasional blue latex glove tossed aside, and the one or two broken police-issue flashlights, it seemed like the last people inside had been in a hurry to get out. Given this was where 7 people had presumably died, I assumed it was someone's job to clean it all up. But the corridor looked largely untouched. Just a few meters in and manic writing started to cover the walls, the desperate scrawls of a lone survivor left there to be rediscovered like cave paintings. Most were deliberations on how to get out, diagrams, blueprints, equations and formulae, all focused on the door and the circuits responsible for its faulty lock. I instinctively assumed they belonged to Daniel and that he'd been the last to die. What a god-awful fate for a man to outlive his children. And yet, it got worse. Slowly, the writing changed from equations and plans to a desperate scrawl. The same few phrases repeated over and over. 5 doors. 5, not 6. 6. Didn't make it. Didn't make it. 6 doors. 6. It seemed like the kind of thing you'd find in an asylum. A psychotic rambling punctuated only by 6 paragraphs right at the end. Each letter was impeccably neat, and each small paragraph was topped with a beautifully drawn Christian cross. Daniel Vance, aged 15. A gifted guitarist. He liked boys even though he thought I did not know. I loved him with everything I had. He would have made a great man. Alicia Vance, aged 14. She liked to paint and to shoot. She had her mother's mean streak. It would have served her well in the future. Elijah Vance, aged 8. The smartest of us all. These were Daniel's memorials to his family, and seeing the words lit up by my torch was a haunting insight into the overwhelming despair he'd endured. He must have realized he wouldn't get the chance to speak at his family's funerals or to write their obituaries. This was his last desperate way of making sure the world might one day know them as he did, as real people. The words marked the end of the tunnel, standing adjacent to a trapdoor in the ground. It was not open, but the tunnel came to a dead end immediately afterwards, and Ripley's prints disappeared at the hatch. I feared he might be in danger, but still I stopped and looked at the bunker door 20 meters behind me. The once gloomy forest looked so bright, even on this cloudy day, the air dotted with rain. A part of me felt like I was leaving the whole world behind as I began to climb the ladder down. I entered a large circular living space that was packed with furniture and little nooks and crannies. The walls were covered with folding beds and tables, and every inch was multifunctional. A dining space could become a sitting space, which in turn might be where someone slept or even exercised. It all depended on what particular bit of furniture you unfolded or unclipped or unfurled. 7 people in close quarters, nowhere near enough privacy. It made sense they went with this cluttered, overlapping use of space. But it was still a large room, bigger than most studio apartments. And there were a few corridors that led deeper into the earth, telling me the bunker had unseen depths. I looked for some sign of my dog and soon found his trail, but this far from the rainy copse, Ripley's prints were starting to fade. After barely a few meters, they petered out vaguely in the direction of a nearby door. I wanted to follow, but stopped myself from rushing onwards. It was unlikely Ripley was getting out any other way, and I'd do us no good getting hurt myself. I decided to take a look around and quickly spotted a dinner table. If I needed proof the police had not bothered with a cleanup, this was it. The plates were still out, the food rotten to a strange blackened husk. A child's hat lay across one place setting. The once creamy fleece turned a sickly green and yellow. The chairs had their backs reinforced with wooden beams fitted with long grooves so that something the width of a nail could slide into them. And on each of the cushions were foul-smelling stains that looked oddly like an ass print. I touched one with gloved hands and the material crackled audibly. Whatever it was, similar stains were on the cutlery and plates, and there were even handprints of it placed firmly on the tablecloth. At first I thought it was blood, but that wasn't quite right. It was too contained to be from leaking blood. On the back of one of the chairs, a stain tapered exactly where a woman's waist would be, like a near-perfect silhouette. I shivered as I remembered that Miranda Vance had always been a slim woman, and wondered how she had left her imprint on the gray fabric. Using my torch, I saw that these stains repeated in the oddest of places. Yes, there were some on beds and blankets and even patches of plain floor exactly like you might expect in a room full of sick people. But why did one stain on the floor bear such a strong resemblance to a child huddled in the fetal position? And why was the same stuff all over the TV remote, and on books on shelves and board games too? Everything from sofa cushions to DVD boxes to piles of dirty laundry were covered in the same dried, brownish material that gave off a foul, coppery miasma. I found the jigsaw particularly baffling. Someone had set up another table with 4 chairs, all modified with the same back support as those by the dinner table. And a jigsaw had been laid out with 4 separate piles, but only one was depleted. The rest looked largely untouched, almost like someone had portioned out pieces for 3 other people who had absolutely no interest in going along with it. Maybe Daniel had tried to keep up morale while the family were sick. God help me. If that were true, I couldn't help but imagine the poor man sat there with his loved ones close to death, desperately trying to encourage them to click their own pieces into place while they faded in and out of consciousness. Something about that room emanated madness, and the longer I stayed down there flicking the bright disk of light of my torch from one detail to another, the more I wanted to leave. One door had wooden beams nailed across it. One sofa had been partially disassembled. Multiple beds had been burned, and all the light bulbs had been removed and put in a box on the kitchen countertop. Looking up at the ceiling, I finally had some insight into why the police were so confident the Vances had not survived, despite never finding their bodies. Someone had jammed a human finger into one of the empty sockets, almost like they'd expected it to glow with the flick of a switch. What was it about this place that had caused the police to leave and never return? Not to even take that finger and test it for signs of illness, or even just to confirm who it belonged to. I decided it was time to hurry up and find my dog. People had died in that place, and while I'm not superstitious, I can't be the only skeptic who has done the calculations in his head and realized it costs nothing to be respectful of ghosts. That bunker was cramped, terrifying, and the air stank so bad I started to worry I'd get sick myself. It served no one any good to linger, but I'd be damned if I'd just walk away and leave Ripley to rot down there. It's not like he could climb a ladder and get out on his own, even if I wasn't entirely sure how he'd gotten down there in the first place. Summoning what little bravery I had left, I called out and broke the silence, something which felt like a terrible taboo in that god-awful place, like screaming in a graveyard. "Ripley!" I waited and hoped to hell I'd hear the pitter-patter of his paws, but for the longest of moments there was only the kind of silence that makes you wonder if someone or something in the darkness is holding its breath, trying to look like just another patch of nothing, biding its time until you finally turn around and show it your back. The TV came on with a blurt of white noise that was so loud and so sudden I cried, threw my arms up and nearly fell backwards onto a rolled-out sleeping bag that looked like it had spent a week in the sewer. By the time I realized what had caused the noise, I could already hear a tinny rendition of Daniel Vance's voice. I realized the issue here. I need to emphasize just how little I understand anything that's... I frowned at the screen as I approached. It showed a greenish infrared view of the bunker with Daniel up front and the dinner table behind him. It was grainy and hard to see, but I could clearly tell that his family were sitting in those chairs. Miranda was first to fall ill. Looking back, it makes perfect sense. Miranda often went into storage to fetch food for cooking, and we found it behind one of the refrigerators. So that's, shit. One of the figures in the background slumped onto the table with a loud clank and sent a plate spinning off onto the ground. Shit. Daniel muttered as he got up and grabbed the woman by the shoulders and sat her upright. Miranda never did like my cooking. He snorted a laugh as he fussed with something at the back of the chair. The rods are much better than tape. All those hours spent taping them upright to the chairs never worked. But the rods, they fit right into the spine, and with a little modification, I can just slot them into the chairs. That way everyone is able to join in for dinner. I'm working on something similar for family game night. Daniel wandered over to the camera, and with a grin he lifted it from the tripod and scanned the dinner table. What I saw nearly made me drop my torch. His family were long dead. Gaunt faces, missing noses, lips that had receded to reveal awful grins. These were corpses, plain as day, even when viewed through such a low-resolution image. The only thing that made them seem remotely alive was the way their eyes still reflected the infrared back so that they glowed in the dark. And yet Daniel seemed oblivious to it all. He tousled Elliot's hair, kissed his wife on the cheek, run a hand across one young girl's shoulder. He even picked the young Alexander up from his high chair, and I assume he coddled him. I don't know for sure because I looked away, unwilling to see the poor boy up close. Eyes averted from the screen, I couldn't help but pan my torch across to that same dinner table and shiver as I finally realized what all those stains were. Not quite blood, but close. Liquefying flesh. Left alone for months, Daniel had not put his family's bodies to rest. Instead, he had moved them around from place to place and puppeted them, living life as if nothing had really changed. Looking at where those stains had settled, I saw a clear pattern emerge. He had put them to bed. He had set them dinner. He had propped them up to watch TV, or gave them their favorite books. They even sat there as lifeless husks while Daniel waited for them complete a fucking jigsaw. The idea horrified me to my core. Back to work. It's obviously not part of the original designs. No room on the other side, not on the blueprints. Elliot didn't believe me, and why would he? I made every inch of this place, but I did not install that door in storage on the bottom level. I checked the cameras and some of the photos I took during the build, and the wall is just blank. But the door is there now, and it must lead somewhere. I don't know when or why it opens, but it does, and the next time I'll be ready, because I have to know what's on the other side, and why it did this to us. Alone down here, often all asleep at once. Anything could have slit our throats and been done with it. But it didn't. It took its time, and I have to know why. It took our radios and computers and phones, one by one, none of us noticing until it was far too late. I kept telling the kids they needed to take better care of their things, and even as they complained, I just assumed the phones were lying behind some shelf. Where else could they go in a locked bunker? But it wasn't the children at all. Looking back, there are so many signs. Who kept taking away the lights? Who kept draining the batteries in our torches? How long did we live with it before we finally realized we weren't alone? Was it here every step of the way? A door out of nothing that leads to nowhere, at least most of the time. Because I know for a fact it does not always open onto a blank wall. There is something behind it. I can hear it shuffling around in there, wet breath rattling in its lungs, a horrible sound I hear roaming these halls when it thinks I'm asleep. I listen to Daniel, fascinated by this strangely compelling rant, when movement caught my eye. An infrared camera running in the dark, its image a roiling mess of uniform noise. What was it I'd seen? I paused the tape and rewound. Squinting, I saw 2 pinpricks of light in the darkness just over Daniel's shoulder. Slowly, the image resolved itself in my mind. I knew what I was seeing, and it turned my blood to ice. Miranda Vance had turned her head, and her lifeless eyes glowed as she fixed them on the back of Daniel's head. Not even any point leaving at this stage. I'm no doctor, but that door is giving off enough radiation to kill a family of 7. If none of us had touched it. Being in the same room is risky, but not lethal. But given how sick we've become, it's pretty obvious our curiosity got the better of us one by one, and we all got too close. Or maybe not. Maybe that thing on the other side came through and did this. I don't even know. Wait. What was that? Daniel turned and the camera stopped recording. The image it froze on was of a lone man, bright as a star in the camera's lens, facing off against unknowable darkness broken only by 6 pairs of white, glowing eyes. I became painfully aware of my position relative to the table, and I had the painful premonition that if I turned, those chairs would not be empty. I would see the Vances, all of them, Daniel as well, waiting for me. Heads turned, bodies left to rot for years in the dark. Behind me something shifted. It breathed, loud, quick. I knew what it was. I knew. It came at me so fast that when I felt something hot and wet touch my hand, I screamed, only for the presence to suddenly recoil. But then, without hesitation, it leapt at me and bore me to the ground. I wept as Ripley licked my face. He was shivering and, worst of all, silent, which was not normal. He was not a quiet dog. Not when greeting me and not when excited like he was now. But whatever he'd seen down here, he clung to me and dug his paws into my shoulders like he wanted to be cradled over the shoulder, something he has been too big to do for years. "Oh, you fucking idiot," I cooed in a soft whisper, and even in the dark I could feel his tail wagging. Joking aside, I felt nothing but relief at finding him. "Let's get the hell out of here." I picked him up, straining a little under the weight but refusing to give in to tired muscles, and made for the ladder. It wasn't easy climbing the 3 or 4 rungs to the hatch, but I managed it and gave the hatch a shove. First one hand, then 2. Again and again with everything I had, but still that hatch refused to budge. "Shit," I cried while pounding at it with my fists, but all I achieved was a sore wrist. The hatch had jammed when somehow the handle had been snapped clean off. Now I'd need a pair of pliers or something to cut through the metal bar locking it shut. My fingers couldn't move it, nor could I brute force the hatch open. The metal bar was an inch thick, and, at the very least, I'd need some tools to get at it from this side. At least it's fixable, I thought as I climbed back down and caught my breath. On one wall, I noticed a simple diagram of the bunker made in chalk. It had 3 floors. The bottom was storage, Daniel had mentioned that before, and I noticed that he had drawn through it with a large red X, and the top floor was labeled quarters, where I stood now. But the middle floor was labeled workshops, and it was there I realized that I'd find what I needed. There was one door that opened onto a concrete stairwell, and standing at the top, I shone my light down the spiraling guardrails, unsure of what it was I hoped to see. There were only harsh shadows and the sense of something foul rising up on the air. A smell that tickled my throat and burned a little in my lungs. Had the police even gone down this far? Had they seen what I'd seen on that TV and just left? Somehow, I thought it was unlikely that had been enough to send the entire sheriff's department running. So was it something else that had done it? Something that had been enough to terrify dozens of armed men. Something that was almost definitely down there. The door? I went down quietly. At first I considered leaving Ripley behind, but after losing him the first time, I decided I'd rather risk it just to know that he was right next to me. Besides, he was being quieter than I was, and I didn't feel much like going down those stairs on my own. He accompanied me with only the quiet click-clack of his paws on concrete, a sound I found deeply comforting, as I barely managed to keep my torch from shaking in my hand and my breathing steady. Down one floor, and I found the workshop exactly as you might expect. A large space filled with generators and fuel and water tanks and boilers and heaters and pretty much anything and everything that you'd need to survive, but which you couldn't put outside due to fallout. Wires, pipes, and tubes ran from one end of the room to the other, and even years later, most of the machinery still hummed in the pitch-black emptiness, an idea I found deeply unsettling. Taking one look at that strange tangle of harsh shapes and industrial figures looming out of the walls and floor, I shivered and looked around, quickly finding a small area Daniel had cordoned off for his own use. About a fifth of the total floor space, there was a large workbench and some seriously high-end machining equipment, all very well used. Lathes, buzzsaws, drills, belt sanders, welding torches, everything a man needed to do it himself. And Daniel had been busy. I'm not sure exactly what it was he'd been working, but there was an arm on the bench. It sat atop a pile of papers that had slowly turned brown over the years until the whole thing looked like it had been soaked in tobacco spit. On the whiteboard was a faded but still visible diagram of what looked to me like a ball and socket joint. I thought of the tape, of Daniel's little mechanism to keep his family upright, and then looked at the arm and suppressed a momentary gag reflex. I don't know if Dan had been working on posable limbs, or just a way to put the decomposing remains back together after they'd started to fall apart, but the size of the arm suggested a preteen child, and he'd left it out on the surface like it was a disassembled clock. It was also missing a finger. Just how fucking crazy was he? I wondered as I pinched my nose with one hand and began overturning boxes looking for a hefty pair of pliers or maybe a hacksaw. Ripley backed away from the noise, but once I made sure he wasn't going anywhere, I carried on grabbing and pulling at box after box, hoping I'd find what I was looking for. Anything to break that fucking metal bar. In the end, I managed to get a pair of bolt cutters, a crowbar, and a heavy-duty pair of pliers. One went in my pocket, one went down the back of my jeans, and the other was clutched in my fist, too large to be tucked away in my clothes. The bolt cutters felt hefty in my hand, which was a bit of comfort, but that feeling didn't last long. Something moved in the darkness, out there in the twisted jungle of shadows cast by all those pipes and wires that ran from one machine to the next. A figure moved. Thin, but unmistakably human in its outline. I couldn't help but remember what I'd seen on that tape. Surely it couldn't have been real. Maybe Daniel had rigged something up. Some fishing wire and a motor, maybe? The idea that those bodies had been moving on their own. I couldn't be sure of that, could I? It was a frightening idea, one my mind had latched onto out of sheer panic. That was all. And then I saw them. A pair of white pinpricks reflecting back at me from the depths of that cluttered room. Ripley, already behind me, head nuzzled into my leg, pushed even closer against me, and let out a barely audible whine under his breath. The behavior of a dog who was terrified, close to pissing himself with fear. Just a bit of metal, I told myself as the light shook so violently in my hand I struggled to see straight. Just two shiny bits of metal. They blinked and began to come towards me. If I had any doubts left, they were dispersed by the sight of a pale white hand emerging into the light. I ran straight to the stairs and went to climb them, but only 1 or 2 steps in, and I saw something gripping the handrail on the top floor. A moldy clump of flesh, only just recognizable as a fist. The flesh withered until the fingers were basically bone. Without meaning to, I brought my light up out of habit, and I saw the bloated face of a hairless corpse glaring down at me. I couldn't even tell you if it had been a teenage girl or the 60-year-old Daniel. Either way, I instinctively turned and found another body shambling towards me out of the workshop. I was trapped. Nowhere to go. By the feel of warm fluid on the back of my leg, I could tell Ripley had finally pissed himself. An adult dog, tail between his legs, shivering like a puppy and desperate to be picked up. God, I needed him to just stay together for a little longer. I couldn't take him in my arms, but I couldn't leave him behind either. With nowhere to go, I ran down and entered storage. There was the temptation to stop once I hit the bottom. Down here, the air was thicker, and the sounds of my breathing were muted, somehow distant. But I only had to look back up to see 3 pairs of eyes glaring down at me. So without giving any of it much further thought, I barreled down the corridor and stumbled onto a door at random. Opening it, I saw what looked like your standard storage room, only most of the shelves had been overturned and the food left to rot on the floor. 1 or 2 shelving units were still upright though, and their shelves were covered in tall, opaque boxes that made them a fantastic hiding spot. That, I decided, would have to be where I crouched down and turned off my light. I was already inside when I realized that wasn't all that was in there. The door almost looked normal. I could see why Daniel must have been confused by it because it looked a little bit like all the other doors down there. But it was different too. It was too tall and too wide, about 1.5 feet off the ground, and the metal rusted in its entirety like it had aged out of sync with everything else down there. All around the jam was a profusion of wet, soppy moss like the kind you find hanging off trees in a swamp, and every few seconds the door would leak something strange and oily, like the kind of thing you find in a parking lot on a rainy day. Of course, that wasn't too strange in itself, but the leak was horizontal, defying gravity so that every few seconds a large glob of the stuff would whip across the room and slap into the wall opposite, creating a puddle about the size of a man that defied all reason. Remembering Daniel's words about radiation, I instinctively inched away from this puddle and the door on the opposite wall, backing myself into the darkest, quietest corner I could while I pulled Ripley behind me and hoped to hell he wouldn't give me away. Once I was in there, I turned off my light and waited. I must have taken longer than I'd thought to hide spot because it was barely 2 seconds later when a few figures entered the room. It was pitch black after I'd turned off my torch, but they made enough noise to let me know that at least 2 of them had stumbled in after me. I stayed there, unable to see anything, not sure if they were heading straight for me or just getting ready to leave, forced to hold out and let luck decide my fate. When I finally heard something scrape against the wall barely 2 feet from where I stood, I gave up and switched my light on, desperate to know what was coming for me. The sound had been terribly misleading. Daniel Vance was no more than 6 inches from my face. "Get out!" he hissed from a toothless and cracked mouth. A living corpse, just like the others. Somehow a flash of intelligence remained in those wide, terrified eyes. And then I heard it. The creaking of a door. And without even thinking, I turned the light and saw it on the wall. I saw it open, and behind the strange steel there was more than just plain old concrete. Much more. I saw a raging gullet of flesh. A ringed tube of pulsing muscle lined with teeth the size of hands. A spiraling descent into madness. Hot, fetid air washed into the room, buffeting me and the rotting corpses, all of us paralyzed by what we were seeing, even if, for most of the figures beside Daniel and myself, they didn't have eyes to see with. "What the fuck?" I muttered, unable to take my eyes from the flesh tube beyond that doorway. "It's coming," Daniel whispered as he grabbed me with one fist and hurled me out of the room. I hit the floor and skidded along a slick fluid left by the Vance's footprints, the smell of which turned my stomach. Perhaps the worst detail was that it was cold. I don't know why. I just expected whatever oozed them off them to be feverishly hot, but it wasn't. It soaked my shirt like I'd fallen into a muddy puddle. "It's coming." This voice wasn't Daniel's. I couldn't say for sure, but it sounded like a child's whisper. One by one, the bodies shuffled over to the open door and knelt before it. I don't know why, but I got the impression the others had lost pretty much everything left of their minds. But Daniel remained aware. He looked back at me once more and spoke before he pressed his head to the floor in supplication with the others. "The only thing we did wrong was being here for it to torture. It didn't need a reason, just an opportunity. Leave. It won't let us go. It won't even let us die. And if it catches you, it won't let you go either." His forehead kissed the dirt. And then something reached through the door and gripped his head in its palm the way you or I might pick up an apple. In full panic, I ran over and grabbed my dog and the bolt cutters, and I ran like my legs were pistons, machines whose signals of exhaustion and fatigue could not slow me down or cause me to fall. I had to move. I had to leave. The hand that had grabbed Daniel. The sight of it flushed my mind clean like some kind of enema. It hurt to see the image replay in my mind, but there was nothing else in my head echoing around except the sight of fingers with one too many knuckles and nails as large as a smartphone. I reached the top floor and nearly collapsed from breathlessness, but I wouldn't let myself stay down for long. I crawled over to the ladder and climbed up and immediately went to work trying to cut the metal lock. It was hell with just one hand, the other clinging to the torch that I kept frantically pointing at the door behind me. And it wasn't long before I fumbled one too many times and dropped my only source of light. No, I mewed. But there was no time to look for it. I had to get out, and I had to get out fast. I couldn't see, but I was sure I could hear something climbing up those stairs. Not the steady thump-thump of human feet. No, this was different. This was a rapid pitter-patter of a spider, maybe. Something with hundreds of feet or hands or God knows what, skittering along the floor and walls and ceiling, pulling itself along with a body whose mere shape would offend God. Using all my strength, I leaned hard on the bolt cutters and, at last, the bolt gave. I threw the hatch open and got just enough ambient light to see Ripley hovering at the bottom of the ladder, growling ineffectually at the doorway. I crouched down, scooped him up, and fled up the ladder so quickly that my muscles turned to jelly at the top and I fell over onto hands and knees. But still, I was out. The long corridor covered in writing was ahead of me, and at the very end, a doorway capped now by the tired blue light of a full moon. Ripley needed no encouragement. He whipped down the corridor with canine speed and I followed at a broken and stumbling crawl, eventually shouldering past the open door and collapsing onto the forest floor. For a few seconds I drifted in and out of consciousness, but when I looked up and saw the canopy overhead moving, the branches backlit by a full moon, I snapped awake and glared down at something gripping my ankle. The hand had reached out of the dark and seized me, and was slowly dragging me back into the earth below. Whatever it was, most of its body lurked out of sight in the shadows behind the doorway, but the hand that crushed my leg was the size of my torso with an arm that looked like it belonged to a mole rat. I struck it with my own fist. I dug my nails in. I cried and kicked and screamed, but nothing could stop it. From behind the door, something like a face grinned and leered at me with joy. It was taking its time, sure enough, pulling me in so slowly that it gave my mind all the time in the world to appreciate the nightmare that awaited me. I think if, in that moment, you'd given me a gun, I would have shot myself, because God help me. I couldn't escape the look in Daniel's eyes, how he'd knelt to worship this thing like a man who knew that hope or pride or joy or anything, with even a hint of goodness to it, was so far out of reach for him, it might as well be a dream. How long was this thing going to keep them down there? How long did it intend to keep me? I wept like a child, feeling like my mind was slowly cracking as I tried everything to stop that fucking pulling me into the shadows. I kicked at the earth. I dug into it using my hands looking for a root or a pipe or anything to hold on to. Nothing I did would slow it down. I was no more than a foot from the doorway when Ripley reappeared. A dog afraid of hoovers and plastic bags and doors that move on their own. A dog who once got stared down by a particularly feisty rabbit who stopped mid-chase and turned around, baffling the predator on its tail. A dog you couldn't even watch scary movies around. And he lunged at that arm like he was a wolf, like he'd always been one. And while he didn't quite break the skin, the pressure was enough to make the thing's grip weaken and I slid my leg out. Unable to stand, I knelt and grabbed the dog and pulled as hard as I could. And now that fucking thing bled at last as the pressure of the jaws and the sliding teeth ripped into its flesh. Together, at last, Ripley and I were let go and sent rolling backwards head over hells. I wasted no time waiting or looking or processing. I heaved the dog to my chest and crawled until I passed out, making it maybe half a kilometer away. Only when I could no longer see the door did I let myself fall to the ground face first and gave up consciousness. The doctors said I had pneumonia, which I suppose made some kind of sense. I might have even believed them were it not for the sheriff's visit, asking strange questions of me as I lay in bed about what I may or may not have seen. I dismissed them to the best of my ability. I wasn't interested in chasing that particular nightmare down. figuring out if it had been real or not, at least not while I lay there half drowning in my own infection. To be fair, I had at least some sympathy for why the police had done so little to seal that place off. I have on occasion thought about going and doing the job myself, but to this day I still have nightmares about being pulled into the dark beyond that door. Not just the bunker door, the one I narrowly avoided at the end, but the one below. What I saw was a kind of madness, I'm sure of it, and I often think of Daniel's words. It didn't need a reason, just an opportunity. Somehow the Vances were that opportunity. Maybe they built their bunker on a ley line, or a weak spot between dimensions, or the site of former satanic rituals. I'm not sure it even matters. They went into the dark thinking it'd be a safe place to wait out the world's troubles. But something had been down there waiting for them, waiting for a chance to get at a family of 7 people, to lock them in and deprive them of escape and slowly take from them everything it could. I've moved since then. Couldn't help it. It wasn't just the memories, you see. It was the shortwave radio I kept in my basement, something my father passed on to me when I was just a boy. God, I'd forgotten about it, at least until I woke up one day to the sound of it blaring white noise down in the dark. And buried in that sound was the faint whispering of a man, his voice barely recognizable but unmistakably his. Let them go, 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 let them go. My wife has a removable face. I've never glimpsed what lies beneath it, but my best friend has. Samantha told me about it on our 3rd date. We were watching a movie on her couch when I made my move to kiss her. She whipped her hand in front of my face and blocked me. "There's something you need to know," she said. I braced myself. Here it comes. "I'm not ready for a relationship. Nothing to do with you, of course." It was the absolute last thing that I wanted to hear, because I was already crazy about her. "Okay," I said. "I have a removable face." That's a new one. "You have a what now?" I was about to laugh, but she was wearing a deadly serious expression. "I have a removable face. Is that like a metaphor or something?" "Number, my face is literally removable. Look, closely." She lifted her chin and traced her jawline with a finger. "You can see the seam." After admiring how beautiful her neck was for a dizzying moment, I leaned in for an inspection. It was very hard to see, but it did look like there was a slightly unnatural transition there from her face to her throat. I grew dizzier as a dozen questions rushed into my brain. "Don't bother asking why or how or anything like that," said Samantha. "I can't tell you that. If that's going to be a problem, you should leave now. I'm letting you know this because I like you, and I want to take the next step. But this is non-negotiable." "Okay," I said, unsure of what was happening. "Not a problem." "So what?" "You have a removable face." "Who cares? It looks good." "There's something else. Once a day, usually in the evening, I have to remove the face and disinfect the inside of it. If I don't, it will rot. This takes about an hour, give or take, depending on how my day went. During this time, you must never ever look at my real face. Never. Do you understand?" Yes. Got it. Don't ask about it. Don't look at your real face." Samantha stood up. "Now, I'm going to go into the bathroom and clean my face. That will give you plenty of time to think about what I've told you. If you're here when I'm done, that's great. I would like that. But if you're gone, I'll understand." She turned and walked into her bedroom. I sat in stunned silence as I heard the bathroom door close. I gave the thing some serious thought. It was possible that it was a joke of some kind. It was possible that it was a delusion. Was it possible that it was true? Well, it was certainly possible to transform an actor's face with movie makeup, so I supposed it was possible that Samantha wore a removable face every day. Maybe she had had a horrible accident where her flesh had been mangled. Maybe her face had been melted by acid or burned by fire, or the skin shorn off by heavy machinery. If it had, I would never know, because she would never tell me and I would never see it. I pictured a face of raw, naked muscle rotting away. Could I kiss her, if that was what I was kissing? But wasn't that what we all were, under the skin? Just muscle and bone and blood and squishy organs? I paced around the living room, running my hand through my hair. I liked Samantha, a lot. She was smart and funny and beautiful. But was that beauty real? Did it count? Did it matter if it was real or not? Was I being superficial, even worrying about it? When she came out of the bathroom, I was still there. I looked at her face. She smiled, and I was in love. We dated, we moved in together, we decided to get married. For the most part, it was a completely normal relationship, typical of two young people in love, building a life together. During the day, it was easy to forget about the face altogether. It looked natural enough, and only in certain positions, in certain lights, was there ever any indication that it wasn't natural. But every night was the same. Samantha would close herself in the bathroom, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for 2, and clean the inside of her face. The curiosity never left me. I would sit there and wonder what was under that face. I came so close to barging in on her a few times, but I never did. I did occasionally ask her about it. About what, if anything, had happened. About how it was possible to make the removable face look so real. About what it really looked like underneath. I tried to coax her into showing me, assuring her that I loved her no matter what, and didn't give a damn what her real face looked like. I was just curious, that's all. She never showed me or told me the story behind it. She didn't get upset at me, unless I was really badgering her. She'd just shrug and say, "You know you can't see it. You know I can't tell you about it." I never told anybody about Samantha's removable face. It's not that she asked me not to. I just didn't think it was anybody's business. Except once I did tell somebody. It was during my bachelor's party. We had rented several cabins in Big Sur and spent the night drinking and packing our noses with powders that we shouldn't have been packing our noses with. Everyone else had passed out and the sun was creeping up behind us as I stood on the majestic cliffs with my friend Chris, looking down on the Pacific waves crashing against the rocks. Chris was my best friend, as close to a brother as I'd known. We'd grown up together and visited each other at college often and spent the summers together. After college, we'd moved to different cities, but we stayed in close contact. Standing there on the cliffs, I told Chris about Samantha's removable face. At first, he thought I was joking. Then he had 1,000 questions, most of which I couldn't answer. "What's underneath?" "I don't know, man. I don't know." "Doesn't that drive you crazy, not knowing?" I shrugged. "Lots of stuff I don't know. Don't know how to do calculus, and I don't know what happens when we die. But dude, she's about to be your wife, and you don't even know what she looks like. I mean, I'd have to take a look. Like, you could set a camera up in the bathroom. That's where she does it, right? Set up a camera and have a look, and then you'll know." I sighed. "Yeah, it drives me crazy. I've asked her 1,000,000 times, but she told me I could never look. Gotta respect that, man, even if I don't like it. That's love." Chris laughed. "You telling me to respect a woman?" Up is down now. Then we fell back into talking about old times as a new day dawned. Chris was in town for business last week and planned on spending the weekend at our house. The conversation at Big Sur had happened 4 years ago, and we hadn't spoken about Samantha's removable face since, despite keeping in close contact and seeing each other as often as two people transforming into adults in different parts of the country can. It happened on Saturday evening. We were lounging lazily in the backyard, deep into the beer, having just finished with some grilled steaks when I got a text from work. "God damn it," I groaned. "I have to make a work call." "Seriously?" said Samantha, raising an artificial eyebrow. "On a Saturday night?" "My biggest client, baby. Sorry." "It is what it is, I guess," said my wife. "I'm going to head inside and get cleaned up. Chris, are you okay just hanging out for a bit?" Chris smiled. "I'll be fine. Got my beer, got some weeds to pull in your garden. God knows your lazy-ass husband isn't going to do it. Those tomatoes are choking to death. It's a tragedy." I rolled my eyes and went into the side yard to make my call. 15 minutes into it, I heard the screams coming from inside. Both my best friend and my wife were wailing in terror. I dropped the phone and ran into the house and down the hall to our bedroom. Through the open door, I could see that the door to the master bathroom was also standing open. "Don't come in," screamed Samantha. "I don't have my face on. Call an ambulance. He looked. Oh God, he looked." She sounded desperate and truly horrified. That made me desperate and horrified, and I wanted to rush into the bathroom, but I knew suddenly that that would be a mistake. I knew suddenly that Samantha didn't want me to look at her real face, not out of a sense of vanity, but for my own safety. Chris staggered backwards out of the bathroom. He was holding a straightened-out paperclip which he had used to pick the privacy lock. Now he was stabbing it again and again into his eyes, shouting gibberish. He was clearly in the depths of madness, and it turned my stomach to see him mutilate himself. "Call a fucking ambulance," my wife screamed. "Don't come in here. He fucking looked." I turned and ran back to the side yard, where my phone was lying in the newly mowed grass. My client was still on the line, alarmed, asking what was happening, what all the screaming was. I hung up on him and called 911. When the paramedics arrived, Chris was having a seizure in the hallway. Samantha was stroking his head, sobbing. Her face was on, but it had been done hastily, and everything looked a little off. My world has been dark this past week. My best friend is in a psychiatric hospital under suicide watch. He's completely blind and mostly catatonic, except when he slips into a violent, babbling mania. The doctors are optimistic that his state is temporary, but they don't know the truth about what caused it, because I told the paramedics that Chris had taken a large dose of psychedelic mushrooms and fallen into psychosis. I saw no good reason to tell the truth about what had happened. Who would believe that one look at my wife's real face would make somebody insane? At best, we would be the subjects of a long investigation. At worst, we would have to prove that what we were saying was true by showing somebody Samantha's face. Then the same thing would happen again, and what after that? I had no idea and no interest in finding out. For Samantha's part, I knew that she would never consent to show anybody her real face, no matter what the consequences of refusal were. I did get a follow-up call from the police asking me to confirm my story. The hospital found no traces of psilocybin in Chris's blood, though that's not unheard of since it has a short half-life. If they end up testing his hair, I will likely be in a lot of trouble, but that's truly the least of my concerns. Samantha is in a state of her own. She still cleans the inside of her face, though not as regularly, and when she puts it back on, it's always crooked now. It is beginning to smell a little bit. I've tried to assure her that it wasn't her fault. He knew, I said. I told him that nobody was ever allowed to look at it. He knew, and then he broke into the bathroom. "This is not on you, baby. Please, talk to me." "Not on me? That one look at my fucking face makes people insane. Please, I just need some time alone." As for me, I am doing my best to hold it together. Do you know what's strange, though? Despite what happened to Chris, I still find myself curious about what my wife's real face looks like. More curious than ever, really. When I was a kid, my dad kept a second family in our basement. Growing up, I thought everyone had a second family in their basement. In retrospect, I understand how ridiculous that sounds, but it was all I'd ever known. I knew that every night, my dad tented the leftovers from dinner with foil, got up without a word, and carried the plate to the basement. I'd listen from my room as he lumbered down the creaking steps, held my breath to hear the muffled mumblings of his greeting. I knew that every morning he'd make the trip downstairs to see his second family off before work, then kiss me on the top of my head and ruffle my hair as he walked out. I knew that each Christmas, he'd bring a sack of brightly wrapped packages downstairs in a Santa suit. I knew that my dad had a second family in the basement, and it seemed so normal that I thought everyone else did too. I'll never forget the first time I asked my mom about them. I was young, maybe 5, when I finally found the words to ask, "Mommy, why can't I play with the people in the basement?" My mom was the human embodiment of frenetic energy, an organic, perpetual motion machine. always pacing or cleaning or stirring a pot, always with a lit cigarette tucked between her yellowing fingers. I'll never forget that. As that question hung in the air, she finally stopped for the first time. Her stillness was unsettling in a way I can't quite explain. "We don't talk about them," she rushed, chasing the hurried statement with a lengthy drag off her cigarette. She blew a plume of smoke out the opened window before leaning down to meet me at face level, her bloodshot eyes mere inches from my own. "You don't need to play with the kids, but the kids need Daddy." She paused again, the haunting image of her at a standstill etching itself into my mind permanently. Finally, she muttered, "Daddy needs them too." That night, I heard my mom shrieking at my dad in their bedroom. I was surprised that they didn't know that I knew, more shocked, frightened even, to find that they didn't want me to know. Most of all, they didn't want me to tell anyone at school. Anyone at all, really. After that night, everything was different. My dad only tented the leftovers after dinner, only brought the food downstairs after I'd gone to bed. He stopped visiting them in the mornings altogether. My mom started acting differently too. I'd always noticed that she was distant from my dad. Had always noticed how she bristled under his touch, how she stole away to the other side of the room whenever he entered. But it got worse after that. As a kid, I felt deeply guilty. I felt like I'd ruined my parents' marriage. But I was just a kid, and I was curious. My mom meant to dissuade me from asking more questions, but she accidentally gave away something that made me even more curious. The downstairs family had kids, maybe kids my own age to play with. I needed to know about them, in the way that little kids need to understand all of the strangeness of this chaotic world, need to make sense of the nonsense that surrounds us daily, the nonsense that we become acclimated to as adults but struggle with endlessly as children, like a puzzle or a riddle or a word problem on a math test about buying 80 watermelons. Another change following that critical night. The basement door was fitted with sturdy lock. Even still, I needed to know. There's something horribly dreadful about finding out that a second basement family is abnormal. Something more horrible still about not knowing who or why. By the time I was 7, I made up my mind to get to the bottom of it. To avoid getting in trouble, I could only investigate when 3 conditions were met. I was home from school, my dad was still at work, and my mom wasn't around to catch me. These circumstances rarely overlapped, but the first time I came home from school to find that my dad's car wasn't in the garage, and my mom's endless movement had driven her to the point of exhaustion, I threw off my shoes and crept to the basement door, quiet in my sock feet. And then I knocked. It was a quiet knock, for fear of waking my mom from her nap. But it was a knock, nonetheless. It was more than just a knock, too. It was an initiation, an invitation, a confrontation of my life's greatest and most terrifying mystery. I jumped when a gentle knock returned from the other side. It was almost immediate, like the person on the other side had been waiting for me. The thought froze me in place for a moment, but I knew I didn't have time to waste. My mouth felt suddenly of sandpaper and chalk, but I leaned into the door to whisper, "Hi. Hi." It was a little girl, her voice sweet yet timid, like testing the keys on a piano for the first time. I'm Ricky. What's your name?" A long pause. "Lila. My brother's is Isaac, but he doesn't talk so good. But he's still little. Mommy says he'll start talking when he's ready." And at home I had Lila. As we spoke more, a never-ending stream of back-and-forth questioning crammed into the briefest moments of time, we both came to understand the differences between us, between our lives and our circumstances. The differences that at first felt so normal grew bigger and sharper and scarier than either of us could comprehend. The unfairness of it all became impossible to ignore. Lila lamented that she wasn't allowed to go to school, that she couldn't go outside to play or make friends or ride bikes around the cul-de-sac in the summer until the street lamps flickered on and the cicadas started to scream. She even longed for the things I loathed most. Homework, rinsing off my dishes after dinner, tidying up my room each Sunday morning. She said she'd lived in that basement all of her life, was probably even born down there. She couldn't remember anything different before being locked up in the cold and musty room. I'm ashamed to admit this, but eventually, I couldn't manage the guilt I felt for living the life Lila never had, could never have in my mind. I was so young, so naive. I didn't know how to manage the situation anymore, so I did the only thing I could think of. I stopped trying. I stopped visiting Lila. No more secret, whispered exchanges. No more quick knocks on the door just to let her know that I was there, that anyone at all was there for her. Days and weeks and months and years trickled by with Lila never quite leaving my thoughts, but with her existence instead. Compartmentalized, confined to the basement of my own mind. At home, it was harder to keep thoughts of her locked away. When my dad brought her dinner hours past my bedtime, I'd lay awake warm in my bed. Sometimes I'd hear her scream. Sometimes I'd hear the tray clatter to the floor, the plate fracturing on impact. Sometimes I'd hear her crying, awful, painful sobs, while I assembled new Lego sets in the playroom. Sometimes she would call out my name. I'll never forgive myself for this. I hate myself for it, and I deserve to. But I ignored her every time. Worst of all, though, was when she started knocking. I was finishing up my science homework for the day when the first knock came. A quiet knock, but a knock nonetheless. An initiation, an invitation, a confrontation. My blood ran cold as I realized where it was coming from, who it was coming from. I hopped on my bike and didn't come home until dinner was on the table. That night, I heard my dad scream back at Lila for the first time, yelled for her to knock it off with all the knocking. He took care of her little brother and her mom, and that he could only do that if she stayed in the basement, if she stayed quiet. She wasn't persuaded, though, and her knocking only grew more frequent and louder. I was about 10 years old by then, so I had a little more freedom. All the freedom in the world compared to Lila. I avoided my house at all costs, only returning in the evenings, where I'd be greeted immediately by the knocking. By then, it was less knocking and more ramming the total weight of her body into the door. My mother took to vacuuming the house obsessively just to cover up the noise. She wouldn't even look my dad in the eye anymore. I imagined the bruises blooming on Lila's shoulder, up and down the length of her arm. If it hurt her, she didn't let on. She didn't stop. Sleep became a distant memory, leaving me dazed and irritable and confused and, most of all, terrified. I began showing up at my school friends', now my only friend's house unannounced just to escape Lila's knocking. His parents clearly didn't like me, and tensions rose between the two of us kids, escalating to a boiling point that ended in a fight. I slugged him in the gut, and he returned with the words that broke me, broke everything. A blow far more powerful than he could have delivered with small hands balled up into fists. "My mom says you're a bastard, that your mom's a whore." I had to look up the words in my dictionary when I got home. I had to gather the courage to once again ask a difficult question. "Mom, am I a bastard?" I had to watch my mom lose her momentum, to stop again. I had to watch what little light she had left in her go out. I had to sit there as she left the room, had to sit there spilling hot tears as the knocking kicked up again, each powerful thrust against the door racking my mind, a painful reminder that Lila was coming for me. But my mom came back, and she returned with an old newspaper clipping in her hands, worn at the edges. She held it to her chest as she finally told me the truth about Lila, about Dad's second family in the basement. I was young, but I needed to know. My mom knew it too. Through choking sobs, she told me about my dad's old family, the one he'd had and made before he met her, the horrible mistake they'd made, the one that gave her the best thing she'd ever had in her life but took away 3 others, about how my dad's old wife was already skating on thin ice, her cries for help that went unanswered, how when she found out about what my mom and my dad were doing that what little was left beneath her shattered, about how they couldn't have known, but about the guilt she carried regardless. Like a heavy backpack, Mom. Yes, sweetie, but I can never put it down. That Lila was dead, and Isaac too. That their mom had done that to them, and then did it to herself too. My dad found them in the basement when he got home from work. That he'd never forgiven himself, and my mom never had either. That when they reappeared back in the basement like nothing had happened, even after their bodies were taken and buried all those years ago, they couldn't think of anything to do but to give them as normal of a life as possible. Yet another difficult question. But why do they have to stay in the basement? I found out later that evening when my dad came home from work and unlocked the door. Lila came out of the shadows, and I flinched instinctively as I saw her face for the first time, saw the gaping hole in her face where her left eye should have been. Isaac was little like Lila said, but the oozing wound to his jaw would have made it nearly impossible for him to speak if he had the chance to grow up. I was scared at first, but I put on my brave face and took Lila by the hand. I played with Lila and Isaac for the first time, shared my toys with them, laughed with them. I didn't meet their mom that day, but I would, years later. Once she and Lila and Isaac knew what became of them, she struggled to cope. She doesn't come out often, but I treat her with kindness when she does. The woman I know her as now couldn't imagine doing what she did. My dad's second family still stayed inside, but they were no longer confined to the shadows of the basement after that day. They became less of my dad's second family, as we all became one larger family that laughed and played and loved together. I don't live in that house anymore. I'm an adult now, with an enormous appreciation for all of the freedom and opportunities available to me that I once took for granted. I know my family is far from normal, even horrible and horrifying in many ways that I helped to perpetuate as a kid. But it's all I've ever known. I love them. All of them. I still visit whenever I can, for birthdays and for Christmas, and for summer vacations. And whenever I do visit, I take a moment to be grateful for the fact that when I knock on the front door, Lila opens it.